cities govern marginal bodies. This research includes a central focus on graffiti management and the role of informal urban arts practices in the creative economy. Cameron has published his research in peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and has prepared reports for urban governments that have informed policy and development. He's recently completed research with the City of Sydney is on Graffiti and Street Art, which consider the different ways that practice are valued in local urban contexts. Cameron holds multiple degrees, which he can explain. I'm not going to list them all off. And just to say that he's a long-term friend and colleague of ours, and we really value the input that he makes. So it's a privilege to have had him here today. I'll hand over to Cameron and then I'll introduce Pedro.
Thanks very much, Marcus. It's great to be here. People are always saying, "What, you've come all this way?" It's easy to come all this way. Well, that wasn't easy yesterday. I was a bit jet lagged, but it's easy to come because these events are really important. And I'm really impressed with the Graffolution work, and I was just saying to Cameron before that I think it's going to be a useful tool, particularly for someone like me, looking from afar and getting a sense of what's happening here in Europe in real time. So, regimes of value and graffiti, celebrating diversity or enforcing difference. For those of you who are here this morning, this will carry on from what I was talking about this morning. For those of you who may have seen me talk last year, some of this will run over some of the material I presented last year, but I'll give it a little bit more depth. Thank you for running that last session with wine. That's probably going to help some of us here, maybe not me. Okay, so I'd like to start with this image because I like it. I took the photograph in a place known by Sydney graffiti writers and street artists as the tram sheds, for obvious reasons. The building was the depot for a section of the Sydney tram network. For those of you who know Sydney, you know we don't have trams, not since 1961. This site was closed actually in 1958. I'm not sure when graffiti began in this site, but this derelict building has become a hall of fame for graffiti writers in Sydney, just like other post-industrial sites in Sydney and other cities. These leftover spaces have been colonised by graffiti writers. They've become key sites in the subculture, invisible to outsiders but central to those in the know. And so here's another example. It's a bit dark, that photograph. You can see some work there. The work there in the foreground with the eye is by Beastman. Here, Numbskull with the cartoon-esque character there and Roach. This site is the Dunlop factory. These photos were taken by Samantha Edwards-Vandenhoek, who created the Sydney Graffiti Archive as part of her PhD at my university, Western Sydney. These photos tend to show what we might think of as illegal work, but these street artists are involved in working across the spectrum of practices, including work that would be considered unsanctioned or illegal, but they're also operating out of a studio. I mentioned this morning some of these names. They're doing sanctioned work, they're doing funded work, and in this case, it looks like it's illegal work, but actually they're in this place with the tacit approval of the building owner. So the building owner didn't mind having those graffiti writers and street artists come in and use that space. So even though this looks like illegal practice, it's actually sanctioned, and they're not going to get in trouble for being there. Okay, so and now this is back again, very dark in this image, and I apologise for that. It's moody. This is the Rozelle tram depot. Both of these sites are now subject to being subject to redevelopment. This site here is being redeveloped by Mirvac as part of the Harold Park Urban Renewal Project, which includes the tram shed and the old Harold Park Paceway, which will become a 1,250 residence development. The tram sheds itself will form a key element, housing a boutique retail development for the site. I got access to this site after Mirvac took control. I was undertaking a survey, as Marcus mentioned. I've been doing some work with a colleague of mine I mentioned his name before, Kurt Anderson, from the University of Sydney. We were doing some research with the City of Sydney, doing a survey, and when Mirvac said they were interested in saving this site, some of the graffiti in this site, we got in contact with them, and they said, "Oh, fantastic, come along and we can work together." So we got into this site and took a bit of a survey. They asked us, essentially, so it was being used as a car park at the time, they asked us what pieces were important so that they could, perhaps protect those pieces as a part of the redevelopment. And they were disappointed that we didn't pick this chintzy lion kissing image, because from their perspective coming in, they thought that looked like street art, and they thought that that would be the thing that we would pick as being of value that they could then put under perspex and protect and use that in their redevelopment. We, of course, said no, it's more likely to be something like this, which Puddle and Phibbs, long time and still active writers and street artists in Sydney. And so we thought that this, or there were other areas where we thought that there looked like there might be some international writers who had done some work there that might be important, that they could think about protecting. So there was a clash of valuations going on. They were looking for something and we were giving them something else. Two different types of values were being deployed. They thought the pretty street art line would be worth something. We did an evaluation, and it was myself and Kurt, but we also had two of our research assistants who were both experienced, one experienced graffiti writer, been doing graffiti since the 80s, and one street artist, a stencil artist who'd been working for many years. And they helped us to look at these and to assess the value from a writer's perspective, from the subcultural perspective. So this starts to talk to the point that where I ended in the last talk this morning, that there is good graffiti and street art in the city, and that there are multiple valuations of this graffiti and street art. That there exists what can be called value pluralism in this area of graffiti and street art. So for people who run cities, who plan and manage the urban spaces of the 21st century, the dominant way we value the city is economic. Being able to distill the value of the city down to a set of economic costs and benefits allows a ready reckoning of the right thing to do when making decisions that affect the lives of city dwellers. Whether we're concerned with the everyday decision making that keeps our cities moving, or the big strategic decisions about how we develop our cities, the judgments and decisions made by city managers, politicians, public servants, private developers and the urban citizenry can be understood through theories of value. Now, the value system that takes precedence over others is the economic. Marx's theories of value provide us with some understanding of how economic value systems work, as do neoclassical supply and demand models. But how might we look beyond the economic to capture more fully the range of ways our cities are valued? And how might we use these other ways of valuing the city to help in our strategic decisions about urban development and our everyday decisions about the right way to be in the city? So in order to begin an investigation of the way we value cities that moves beyond a reductive economic frame, in this talk I'm going to talk about the moral, I'm going to start by talking about what we can call the moral geographies of the city. The investigation of moral geographies involves the understanding of the way our ethical decisions and moral frameworks are influenced by socio-spatial relations. That is, where things are matter to the way we value things. And we had a little bit of that inclination of that sort of idea about context come through in some of our earlier discussions. How we value and what we value, and what value we give to things are central questions in working through moral geographies. By looking at the city as an ethical project, we may be able to better discern the complex interplay of values and the way these are reconciled and worked through in situated and specific urban contexts. So, this morning I presented a range of ways that we value graffiti and street art as good or bad, in keeping with the theme, beautiful or even destructive. I challenged the idea that graffiti and street art can be subject to a universal criminalisation based on a single idea that graffiti is bad, that it is always out of place. Rather, I suggested that the city was a place of value pluralism, that there were many views of what is good and bad in the city, and that they didn't all agree. This value pluralism animates a plural vision of what we can call the good city and a plural view of good urban life. This is a paper about graffiti and street art, but the argument I'm presenting here relates to this larger discussion about the good city. There's been a shift in urban thought back towards a consideration of what makes a good city. Criticised as naive utopianism or the product of cultural relativism, efforts to outline the good city have suffered in the past. And yet, as the urban planning academic John Friedman says, a century during which the vast is not something that can be measured easily, and it's something that objective scientific research, rational research in the 20th century has shied away from. So both Friedman and later the geographer Asher Min have extolled the virtues of a good city built on a pluralist frame. Friedman uses the central notion of what he calls multiplicity, a point which Amin takes up to mark the need to consider multiple voices in the constitution of the city. So like them, I also take a pluralist position that there are different images of the good city. And this accounts for the diversity of urban experiences that might lead towards a good urban life. So this is also part of a broader project of what I'm thinking of as an ethical urbanism, at the centre of which is the attempt to, as I said this morning, envisage applied responses to ethical questions in urban contexts. Beyond recognising the good city as plural and complex, I want to ask, how do we do the good city? What policy responses help us to include the voices of the many to produce a plural vision of the city? This morning's talk was a little bit light. Here I'm going into a little bit of social theory, cultural theory and philosophical theory. It's lucky that we had a couple of drinks. I'll probably shy over some of this stuff. I'll spare you some of the depth here. But suffice it to say that if we go through a moral geographies perspective, and here I'm going to rely on the ethics of care to present a sort of philosophical position on value pluralism. What does that mean? Okay. The ethics of care is a strand of ethical thinking that's been mobilised in work in moral geographies, in contrast to an ethics of justice. Now, an ethics of justice is based on the ideas of Kant that says essentially there's a universal frame of ethics that it can be, says that there's actually multiple ideas around values and multiple ethical frames. So Kantian ethics is about universalism, and this relates to the way that people like John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas talk about justice. And so in many cases we think about justice as a universal moral framework that underpins ideas of, for example, the way that we might criminalise graffiti. And so when we think about how we criminalise graffiti in the city as universally bad, that could be underpinned by a universal moral frame based on Kantian ideas of justice. Alternatively, the ethics of care says that actually, when we think about it, we don't all respond in the same way to moral questions. In fact, if I have a relationship with somebody, that might impact the way I think about moral questions. And so the ethics of care says caring relationships actually mean that there are different ways that exist simultaneously, that we can actually have different moral frames working at the same time. So Carol Gilligan, Nell Noddings were back there talking about this in philosophy, and they say we need to consider the way our relationships unsettle the assumptions of universal theories of justice based on the rational individual. Virginia Held, more recently, has said, yes, that's a great idea. To have different values, different frames of value is a great idea. However, if we have different frames of value, how can we compare them? And out of this we get the problem of what we call cultural relativism. Okay? And essentially it says that my valuation is better than your valuation? How can we work that out? And so this is one of the reasons why values is something that hasn't been discussed much in the social sciences and humanities. It's because we have the problem of sort of incommensurability, the philosophical problem of incommensurability that says you can't compare value systems. So if I've got my value system that's based on, say, religion, and your value system is based on justice, and I say I'm right, and you say you're right, how can we compare that? How can we reconcile that? Virginia Held said, well, what we need to do is to escape the problem of cultural relativism is to say, yes, there are multiple ways of thinking about values coming through the ethics of care, but we need to find a universal frame of reference underneath, and for that we can use justice. And so here we have Held saying the ethics of care is underpinned by an ethics of justice, giving us a framework underneath that allows us to have value pluralism, but it also gives us a way of thinking about how we might ultimately reconcile different value systems. And so we get a plural vision guided by shared norms. Susan Feinstein has gone further in her work in The Just City to talk about the ethics of care underpinned by ethics of justice, and she's applied that in sort of principles of planning the city. So Friedman and Amin, who I've both talked about, they have plural visions of the city that are underpinned by these universals as well. Multiplicity set against the common desire for human flourishing and civic obligation, that's the way Friedman says. In Amin, he says, an ethics of care incorporating principles of social justice, equality and mutuality. So in all these cases, they're giving us this sort of moral underpinning that allows us to compare our different value systems. So that's the heavy stuff. So let's now move on to talking about some of the regimes of value that I've mentioned before. So one thing that's absent from most of the discussions of the good city are ways we might put these ideas into action. How we can start to think about applying these ideas to our approaches in strategic urban planning and the day-to-day experiences of negotiating the urban lives in ways that align with ideas of the good city. That is, there's an absence of discussion about how we might build in an ethical intention in our present and future urban interactions. So, following Friedman's lead, how can we generate the guiding normative images for city builders of the 21st century? So, to begin to go down this path, we'll talk about graffiti and street art. So, graffiti practice as a global phenomenon has typically been framed by urban managers as disorder that is both transgressive and infectious. The threat of spreading urban disorder underpins moral panics about graffiti vandals and graffiti crime and has led to a slew of zero-tolerance laws and policies in different cities around the world. As I noted this morning, Australia is no exception to this process of policy mobility, with anti-graffiti legislation now the norm at state government level and explicit graffiti management budget lines in a normal occurrence in local government ledgers. Built on the assumption that the community hates graffiti, again, a moral universal, this strong regulatory framing of graffiti relies on a limited moral understanding of graffiti as bad, as out of place in the urban landscape. At the same time, post-industrial cities have turned to the promise of the creative economy and the creative industries to fill the economic gap left by manufacturing. In some cities, this has led to revaluation of certain types of graffiti practice that has allowed and led to the commodification of what's become more widely known as street art. And that's not the only way that street art's known, but that's one of the things that's happening. Now, this is notable in Sydney and Melbourne, where urban graffiti and street art has become an important part of a narrative of creativity and innovation at the core of representations that sell the city into global markets for tourism and investment. So how do we disentangle questions around the value of graffiti and street art? So I'm going to draw on some recent work by another geographer, Tim Creswell, on regimes of value in his research that is set in Chicago. He draws on the work of theorist Arjun Appadurai, who notes that value is a process that's not intrinsic in the object. Rather, a regime of value is a localised system of meanings. Value is produced by the passage of things in and out of what they call different regimes of value. So, the dominant regime of value associated with graffiti and street art is not the economic, as I mentioned before, it's actually the legal one. It's the big question, okay? It's underwritten by the dominance of property values and rights property, and it's the thing that underpins all of the ways our institutions approach the problem of what is this thing called graffiti and street art. So under the normative terms, the legal regime of value has graffiti it presents graffiti as having no value at its best, or at its worst as having negative value. Okay, so it's bad. And so that's the normal way, the normative way that we value graffiti. The implications of this legal regime of value become apparent when we look at the way it manifests in regulatory and institutional forms. Anti-graffiti laws and municipal ordinances depend on the determination of whether a particular instance of graffiti or street art is legal or illegal. Further, and now drawing on the research with the City of Sydney, all the policies and systems in place depend on the question of whether it's legal or illegal. But the problem is, that's not the only way we value graffiti and street art. In order to determine the value of particular cases of graffiti and street art, we need to move beyond the legal regime of value and consider other regimes of value. So in our study, we identified, and again, some of you will, who were here last year for the event will recognise this list that I put up last year, identified in order to understand the way that different actors go about valuing graffiti and street art. And so we've got the aesthetic. So the dominant way graffiti and street art is questioned is that classic, is it crime or is it art? Is it art or is it crime? The aesthetic is one way that we value graffiti and street art. We have economic, subcultural, we have gender, where masculinity is a role there. Socio-spatial, so a sense of place. How's that? Here I am. Okay. Regulatory commodification, temporal, advertising, planning. So even down to the way that the organisation of planning works in the city, we can see that often street art is talked about as creating a community amenity, or it might be used in urban regeneration or revitalisation processes. So there's a range of ways that graffiti is discussed that we can then distill down into sort of different value regimes. Okay? And what I'm saying is that with the ideas of regimes of value, we can start to distill out some of these ways that people think about graffiti and sort of, if you like, de-centre the dominance of that legal framing of graffiti. And so when people say, is it legal or illegal, that may not be the right question to be asking when we think about the contribution of a particular site to the way it's operating in that particular context. It might actually be more about the way it looks, it might actually be more about the way it contributes to a sense of place, it might actually be more about the way that urban revitalisation is being engaged through that, or it might be about the fact that it's an important writer, or it might be about the fact that there's other ways of thinking about it. Okay? So the actual illegal legal question may not be the right question to be asking in terms of its contribution. Now, I know that some people will say, well, that's not going to work, because people judge these things in this way. What I'm doing is I'm giving us a way of, if you like, working through the way we might think about all of these different ways we value, so that we can come out with rational decisions about the proportionality that we, of the approaches that we have to graffiti and street art. And so often the criminalisation of graffiti and street art is disproportionate to the impact of graffiti and street art in its actual context. And so if we can see the way these values align, that might help us in making those decisions. So the types of groups that we have that are making these valuations, the city, so local government, community, neighbours, local residents, action groups, the writers and artists themselves, tourists, developers, in the example that I've given. All of these groups are involved in these different types of valuation. And shifting between these different regimes of valuation produces the result of realising the value that is apportioned to a particular instance of graffiti or street art. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the politics of value. And so this is about doing the good city. This is about how do we actually get things done. Just make sure I don't run over time here. 5 minutes. Okay. So I'm going to, in this discussion, I want to talk about the workings of power and regulation that help sustain particular regimes of value. In the City of Sydney, all the formal institutional structures are underpinned by a moral universal that graffiti is bad. So when one person rings up to complain, all the formal processes, if they are followed, lead to one response: removal. Of course, what we found was that there's a whole lot of informal practices that subverted the formal processes. They worked outside the policies to give room for decisions about how particular pieces of graffiti or street art are valued and what that might mean. That is, they consider the different regimes of value and then they make a determination. And so these are the informal processes that are happening outside of the policy, because the policy is just, is it legal or illegal? Okay? It's stuck within one regime of value. So we made a number of policy recommendations designed to formalise this process in order to produce a more dynamic and responsive policy regime that can change to arrangements of power relations that might lead to changes in the way a site is valued. To do this, we drew on the agonistic pluralism of Chantal Mouffe. I'll come back to that. Now, Mouffe talks about agonistic politics. We talked about agonism. Essentially, agonism is saying that we're in an engagement that's ongoing. Okay, we're going to negotiate this because things change. We need to keep coming back to it. So normal engagement processes will say, let's all get together. Okay, so this is again Kantian universalism that underpins justice. Let's all get together. We'll all talk about it. We're all equals here, and then we come out with a consensus. And then you guys can go away and we'll actually do what we do. Okay, so that's normally how public engagement happens. What agonism says is that actually no, the arrangements of power change over time, and we need to continually come back to that. And now that's good for graffiti, because graffiti is ephemeral. Graffiti and street art's ephemeral, and so things do change. Buildings change ownership. Different things happen in particular sites, and so it's worthwhile going and seeing how things change over time, how the arrangements of power relations, how the arrangements of ownership and stakeholders change over time, so that we can then assess how value is being accorded in that particular instance. And so this provides us, Chantal Mouffe's work and Leclerc as well from earlier, is a plural politics. Okay, it's a plural politics, and we need this sort of plural politics to engage with the plural value systems that I'm talking about in order to inform a plural vision of the good city. So we could call this sort of an ontological pluralism. Everything we're looking at is about making things complex and realising that we're all positioned in different ways and that we have a different thing to say and different visions of how the city should be. Now, the outcomes of this sort of politics are contingent, they change. Okay, and that's a key feature of this politics. And so when we sit down and we say, okay, this piece of, this site is contested, let's get everyone around and we'll say, okay, what's happening here? We do an assessment of it, and then we go, okay, fine, it's like this, and we're going to do this. We're going to, in this stage, we'll remove it. And then a whole lot of people go, that's terrible. That's one outcome. 6 months down the track, that wall may now be active again. It may have something on it, and the arrangement of power might change, and it actually may stay. And so we don't know what's going to happen down the track, but we can make these sort of contingent outcomes, okay? An ongoing agonistic engagement over space. So what I'm going to talk about here now, it's important to know, actually, that's what I'll just go back. I notice I've got 2 minutes. This is the policy regime that I and my colleague suggested
the city might take on board. It involved a register, an archive, and an advisory panel. And they really are looking at a record of current status, evidence of how things are changing, and then an evaluation. And just sort of an ongoing engagement with the way that a site operates. It's not about approving sites. It's just about recognising what's actually happening so that they can then not have control, but understand the informal practices that they're involved in, that they're currently doing, and the policy says one thing and they're doing another. And in this way, we can build sustainable policy so that when that one person who's making the assessment goes away, we've got a policy framework in place that will outlive their sort of institutional knowledge, this informal institutional knowledge. So in the minute I have left, I'm just going to point to a place where this is working, which is actually not in the City of Sydney. It's important to note, I've put this into a report, it's gone to the City of Sydney, they've gone, this is really interesting and risky and difficult, and we're going to just sit on this. And that's where I am with them at the moment. So the council's saying we really want it, but the bureaucrats are all different politics is happening, and so it's actually not progressing. And so this is interesting from my own perspective. And so there's a lot at risk in the City of Sydney. It's the most high-profile local government area. So if we go to the next local government, which is Marrickville, the stakes are much less. In this case, I'm pointing to a site called May Lane, and in the Graffolution platform, May Lane, there's some May Lane documents there. May Lane is a site that began as an informal street art gallery. The local government didn't have anything to do with it. It was a business owner who said to people who were writing, come in the daytime, I'll put boards up, we'll have a barbecue, let's just do this. I'll organise all of the properties around so that we can do this. It's the back lane, a thoroughfare to a train station, one of those places that would be traditionally considered as an area of questionable safety, that has actually been revitalised, and they've done some research around this that says that, yes, people are really happy with what's happened, and so graffiti is actually contributing to the revitalisation of this space. So much so that the local government came on board and said, yes, actually, this should be a street art gallery. And so it operated in this way for about 5 years, and then the guy who was running this, the curator, who owned this business, said, oh, I've had enough of this, I don't want to do it. In fact, what was happening is the dynamics of that site changed. And so the high-profile writers were starting to compete with parents who were dropping off their kids because there's no other legal places to do it. It was becoming too high-profile. And so there was a mix of people who were doing good work, and then people would just come and go over the top of it with bad work, and people were getting angry about this, and so the good writers were starting to not use the space anymore. And so the quality or the aesthetic value of this site went down. As a result, the residents started complaining. They were formerly happy, now they're not. And so the local government goes, oh my goodness, what are we going to do? And so they got everyone together and they had a chat and they decided, okay, fine, we're going to do something different. And one of the key things that I contributed to that discussion was I said, don't think of this as a single site. Think of this as a network of sites and a whole bunch of different types of users. And if you've got young people there, that means that they don't have another site to go to. Maybe you're master planning a park down the road, maybe you put a legal wall in there associated with a youth centre, see if you can move some of those users down there. Now, at one stage there, it looked like it was actually all going to stop. And people were really worried about that. But I said, well, if it stops, it'll start somewhere else. You know, this is the way that this sort of dynamic engagement with public space around graffiti practice happens. And so, essentially, we took this one site that people were worried about and we opened it up into a whole lot of options through this process and took it to its next stage. And the way I like to see that as an agonistic process, because at every step of the way, this was contested by different people who had different sets of ideas about what should happen in this site. And we didn't satisfy everybody, because under the principles of agonism, you don't have to satisfy everybody. You just have to say it's changing, okay? And down the track, it'll change again. So here it is. Here's some of the things that are happening there in that site. And I just want to finish with the fact that the local government put in some shared, made it into a shared zone, so they did formalise that space. So it's a case of sort of a bottom-up. And so there was significant investment by the local government, and so they didn't want to see it fail. But there's every opportunity that it does. What I'll do is, I think I've run over time. My conclusion is probably too long. And so in ending, I think I'll just put up that fantastic quote that's been floating around. The ultimate test of the good city is whether urban public culture can withstand pluralism and dissent. And so I'm hoping that you've got a bit of an insight in how our discussions about value might give us an idea about the plural city and where we're going with graffiti and street art in the future. Thanks.